So today's lesson will be on shipwrecks and salvage. And in the last few lessons we've looked at bacterial corrosion, and we've looked at how that actually affects the steel structures of shipwrecks. And in today's lesson, we're going to look at the byproduct of bacterial corrosion, which is the slightly higher acidity of that area. Okay? And we're going to look at how acidic environments accelerate corrosion. Okay? So we've learned a lot about acids in that topic, acidic environment. And so we're going to look at how it sort of accelerates the corrosion process, particularly at the depths of the ocean. Okay? So before we move on, we're just going to come back to passivation. Now, passivation we studied basically in the first series of shipwrecks. And essentially what happens is in passivation, a metal reacts with oxygen or some other chemical to form a very small or a very thin layer of very inert oxide or some other chemical. So when they react, it forms that thin layer, and that protects the inner layers from further corrosion. Okay, so the outer section sort of corrodes, so to speak, and that corrosion actually protects the inner metal from corroding as well. Okay, and that's passivation. Now, an acidic environment can greatly increase the rate of corrosion in non-passivating metals. Okay, so if you don't have a passivating metal, obviously if you've got an acidic environment, that will accelerate corrosion, right? So if you imagine aluminium, it's a passivating metal. If we chucked it into an acidic environment, no problem. It would just sit there and the acid would just, wouldn't do anything because that passivating metal on the outside just stops that acid from doing anything. Now, if you have something like iron and we throw it into an acidic environment, it will corrode much more rapidly than if it was in a neutral environment. Okay, so that's why we're studying this. Now, the ocean's acidity. So we're always talking about shipwrecks. Remember, we're talking about shipwrecks and ships and things like that. So we're always going to be sort of coming back to the ocean. Now, in general, the ocean's pH is around 8. Okay, it's slightly alkaline. Now, however, in certain regions, what we call microclimates exist, and the pH can be less than 7 in that particular region. Okay, and sometimes you can sort of see that in normal like fluids. You can see sort of certain sections that haven't mixed well, and so you get local sections that have higher concentrations of particular chemicals than other sections. Okay, so it's just sort of a consequence of not mixing fully. So some sections will have lower pH in that area than 7, so it'll be acidic. And microclimates form due to a combination of chemical processes and the activity of microorganisms. Okay, so there's some chemical processes going on, but if you have a colony of microbacteria or microorganisms that are just pumping out H+, then that area will be locally higher in acidity than if you didn't have that bacteria all there. So the bacteria can make a big difference as well. So where did these acids actually come from? So what are those chemical processes that I mentioned? Well, acidity can be created in several ways. So the concentration of carbon dioxide increases with depth. Okay, so it goes up as we go deeper underwater. So the dissolved carbon dioxide produces an acidic environment, so carbonic acid. So when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, you get carbonic acid. And so we've studied that at great length in acidic environment, so that shouldn't be new to you. But here's the equation just if you've forgotten. CO2 plus H2O gives you H2CO3, which breaks up to give you H plus HCO minus, HCO3 minus, sorry. Now outside of carbon dioxide, we have organic material from wooden structures, so wooden ships, as well as dead tissue from organisms, can be oxidized by aerobic bacteria to produce acids. So even though the concentration of oxygen is low, there might just be enough oxygen to allow these aerobic bacteria to decompose these organic compounds, and that gives you acids as well. So for example, carbohydrates are oxidized to form carbon dioxide as well as hydrogen ions. So carbohydrates are things like sugars or starches, and they can be oxidized to give you carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. So that increases the acidity as well. So that extra carbon dioxide will also increase the acidity as well as the hydrogen ions, okay? Precipitation of metallic sulfates by hydrogen sulfide produces hydrogen ions. So basically, if you have sort of metallic ions and you're near hydrogen sulfide, what can happen is you can actually precipitate them out as metallic sulfides, and then if you've got H2S, then the H2 has to go somewhere and it becomes H+, and so you increase the acidity that way. Hydrogen sulfide as another thing is also a weak acid, so that's another form of acid that you can get in the ocean. So now that we know where the acids come from, what is their actual effect on metals? Okay. So hydrogen ions act as oxidants, and they oxidize basically reactive metals, and even some not as reactive metals. So you can see on the very far hand side, you can see that it's very, very vigorous, the reaction with the acid, and as you go down with less and less reactive metals, the reaction becomes less vigorous. Okay. And also, the greater the concentration of hydrogen ions, the more readily the corrosion occurs, which makes sense. If there's more hydrogen ions, you've got more acidity, the corrosion will happen faster. So for iron, the iron solid plus 2H plus gives you the ferrous ion and hydrogen gas. So this is stuff you learned in year 10 chemistry. Okay, so we've seen this before. The reduction of sulfate ions to form hydrogen sulfide is promoted by an acidic environment. So if you look back at your previous equations in the previous lessons, the reduction half reaction of sulfate reduction actually has a lot of H+, requires H+. So if there's lots of H+, we can actually generate more H2S. So it's sort of a positive feedback loop. So you put more H+ in, you get more H2S out. You get more H2S out, you also get more hydrogen ions in general, because H2S is a little bit acidic as well. So you can see that it's sort of just, feeding itself almost constantly. And also, as a side, oxygen is a stronger oxidant in acidic environments than it is in non-acidic environments. So it will actually be a stronger oxidant if there's H+ around than if you didn't have H+ around. Okay. So that concludes today's lesson on hydrogen ions and basically the acidic environment and how it affects corrosion. Okay. So we looked at how acids affect non-passivating metals and where the acids come from in the ocean. Okay, so we'll move on to the question segment now. So, what do some anaerobic bacteria utilize for respiration instead of oxygen? So I think we've gone through this fairly fully now. Basically, they use sulfate and they reduce it to sulfide. Okay, so B. Describe the effect of the acid microenvironment on corrosion. Well, obviously, as we said, acids accelerate corrosion. So the cathode reaction is likely to become something like this. 2H plus 2E minus gives you H2 gas, which is just the sort of the acid, one part of the acid metal reaction. And the low reduction potential for this reaction causes the galvanic cell to react faster. So because that happens fairly regularly, and it wants to do that, it happens to make the reactions much faster because the galvanic potential is low. Okay? Very low energy needed to make this work. Describe how a passivating metal is protected from corrosion. So hopefully this will bring you back to our passivation talk before. Well, passivating metals like aluminium and chromium have a protective coating of oxide on their surface, and these metals will not corrode as long as the coating remains intact. So they won't corrode because there's that film is actually protecting the inner layers, and that film doesn't want to react with anything, so it won't, and so nothing can get into the metal and corrode it as long as it remains intact. Okay. Assess the role of electrochemical cells and anaerobic bacteria in corrosion of shipwrecks at great depths. So assess is pros and cons, but in this case we may use a slightly different approach. So anaerobic bacteria use sulfate ions in seawater for respiration, and they thrive around wrecks using organic materials such as textiles and wood as food. Electrochemical cells occur as iron and other metals are present in seawater, the electrolyte. They would be slow to operate in the freezing temperatures at great depth. However, the growth of anaerobic bacteria stimulates the rate of reaction as the cells by utilizing any H2 produced and providing a source of H2S to react with any cations. Okay, so the cations react with this, and they utilize any H2 that's been generated as well. The reaction of H2S with cations produces acidic conditions, which further accelerates corrosion. Okay? Thus, both electrochemical cells and anaerobic bacteria contribute enormously to the rapid corrosion of shipwrecks at depth. Okay, so they both have their part to play, and they sort of help each other deal with or corrode our shipwrecks. Now, explain how acidic environments can be created around wrecks in the ocean depths. Well, even though the seawater is a little bit alkali at pH 8, acidic microclimates can be created because the activities of microorganisms as well as other chemical processes help facilitate that. So the concentration of CO2 increases with depth, which increases the acidity because of carbonic acid. So the dissolved carbon dioxide produces an acidic environment through hydrolysis, and this reaction we've seen 1,000 times, so we won't dwell on it too much. Now, organic material from wood and dead tissues is oxidized to produce acids. Okay, so oxidation helps to produce acids of these organic materials. And the anaerobic bacteria can use sulfate ions from the seawater to produce H2S, and the H2S is a weak acid and also reacts with metal ions to produce more hydrogen ions. Okay? So that concludes today's lesson on the acidic environment and how it affects corrosion. And so we looked at how acids can actually accelerate corrosion and where do acids actually appear in the ocean. So this also concludes our series on bacterial corrosion. So hopefully you've learned something and refreshed your memory on what bacterial corrosion is and how it affects the ocean chemistry system. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at our next lesson.